Burkina Faso has just said no to one of the most powerful nations on earth, and they said it loud enough for the entire world to hear. In a decision that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, President Ibrahim Traoré publicly rejected a gold and oil deal valued at more than $3 billion United States dollars, reportedly backed directly by former U.S. President Donald Trump. In Ouagadougou, tens of thousands of citizens poured into the streets. National flags waved in the dry Sahel wind, and chants of Burkina Faso for the people of Burkina Faso echoed through the capital's main square. Meanwhile, in Washington, American officials expressed outrage, hinting at serious consequences to come. Why would a young leader, barely in his 30s, risk diplomatic ties, economic aid, and possibly even internal stability to say no? And could this be the opening chapter of Africa's boldest political shift in decades? If you believe that Africa's awakening has begun, stay with me until the end of this story. The announcement came under the blazing Sahel sun, carried live by national television to every corner of Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traoré, standing before a sea of supporters in Ouagadougou, declared that his nation would reject not one, but two of the most lucrative and most controversial offers in recent history. The first came from the United States, reportedly backed by former U.S. President Donald Trump. A gold and oil agreement valued at more than $3 billion United States dollars, granting privileged access to Burkina Faso's mineral wealth in exchange for large-scale infrastructure investments. The second came from France, under the leadership of President Emmanuel Macron. According to diplomatic insiders, Paris had proposed a parallel arrangement, one that would secure long-term French control over a majority share of profits from gold and oil extraction, potentially lasting up to 25 years. It was a deal reminiscent of the old colonial model, offering short-term financial aid while locking in foreign dominance over the nation's most valuable resources. Traoré refused both. With his voice steady and unyielding, he told the crowd, "Burkina Faso's resources are for its people, not for foreign exploitation." His words ignited an immediate reaction. Tens of thousands filled the streets, waving flags and chanting his name. Across Africa, but in Washington and Paris, celebration turned to outrage. The U.S. response came first. Stern warnings of economic sanctions, suspension of aid programs, and tighter restrictions on financial transactions. France quickly followed, with officials close to Macron hinting at the withdrawal of development assistance, the freezing of joint projects, and the possibility of trade penalties. To many in Burkina Faso, these threats were proof of the deep-seated greed that had shaped foreign policy toward Africa for generations. To Traoré, they were confirmation that his fight was not just about a single deal, but about breaking a cycle of dependency that had bound his country for decades. And yet, the world sensed that this confrontation had only just begun. The moment of climax came not in a private meeting behind closed doors, but under the open sky of Ouagadougou. Before a crowd that stretched beyond the city square, President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium, his uniform crisp, his gaze unwavering. He repeated the words that had already begun to echo across the African continent. Burkina Faso's resources are for its people, not for foreign exploitation. The crowd erupted, chants of "Traoré, Traoré," mixed with the sound of drums and horns. Elderly veterans of Burkina Faso's independence movement embraced younger generations in tears, telling them they had not seen such a moment of pride in decades. In Mali and Niger, leaders issued statements of solidarity within hours. "Your courage is our courage," one West African minister declared, spreading beyond Africa's borders into diaspora communities in Europe and North America. But the reaction from Washington and Paris was equally swift and far colder. American officials, still reeling from the public nature of the rejection, warned that Burkina Faso would face significant consequences unless it reconsidered. French President Emmanuel Macron, in a press conference, called the decision a step backward for cooperation and hinted that development aid, worth hundreds of millions of euros annually, could be suspended. Behind closed doors, French diplomats reportedly discussed targeted sanctions on Burkina Faso's gold exports to European markets. For ordinary citizens, these threats were nothing new. They had heard them before, every time an African nation tried to loosen the grip of outside control. Yet this time felt different. Traoré was not apologizing, not backtracking, and not negotiating in secret. He was taking the confrontation into the public square, daring two of the most powerful nations on earth to make good on their threats. In that moment, the young president's gamble transformed into something larger, a rallying point for a continent weary of being told what to do with its own wealth. In the days that followed, the shockwaves from Ouagadougou reached every corner of the diplomatic world. Across Africa, editorial headlines hailed President Ibrahim Traoré as the voice of a new generation and the man who told the West enough. On television talk shows in Lagos, Dakar, and Johannesburg, analysts debated whether this marked the beginning of a pan-African economic awakening. But in Washington and Paris, patience wore thin. American think tanks warned that Burkina Faso's defiance could inspire other resource-rich nations to challenge US and European interests. In Paris, French media close to President Emmanuel Macron described the move as reckless, framing Traoré as a populist gambling with his country's future. The French Ministry of Foreign Affairs began drafting contingency plans for the possible loss of mining concessions, many of which had been held by French companies for decades. Threats became more explicit. US lawmakers discussed measures that would cut Burkina Faso's access to certain international banking systems. French officials leaked hints of a coordinated European embargo on the nation's gold exports. The message was clear. Defiance would come at a steep price. Yet the pressure only seemed to embolden Traoré. In a nationally broadcast address, he reminded his people that freedom is never given, it is taken, a phrase that resonated with the older generation who had lived through the struggle for independence in the mid-20th century. His government began accelerating plans to expand domestic refining capacity for both gold and oil, aiming to keep more profits within Burkina Faso's borders. For the first time in decades, the balance of power in West Africa appeared to be shifting not through coups or foreign intervention, but through a single, unflinching word: number. Within 2 weeks of rejecting the American and French proposals, President Ibrahim Traoré's decision had measurable effects inside Burkina Faso. Public opinion polls conducted by local media indicated that over 70% of citizens supported his stance, citing national pride and economic sovereignty as their primary reasons. The government quickly moved to solidify control over its resources. 3 major gold mines producing an estimated 35 tons annually were placed under increased state oversight. Plans were announced to build the country's first large-scale gold refinery capable of processing up to 10 tons per year domestically, rather than exporting raw ore. In the energy sector, preliminary surveys indicated oil reserves with potential yields of 20,000 barrels per day, which the administration pledged would remain under national ownership. On the political front, Traoré's approval ratings rose sharply, particularly in rural areas where resource wealth had historically brought little benefit. Opposition leaders, some of whom had previously criticized his policies, refrained from open attacks, wary of alienating a population unified by the decision. However, there were immediate economic concerns. Within days, France suspended development aid worth approximately 100 million euros annually. The United States signaled it might freeze at least 50 million United States dollars in planned infrastructure funding. International credit agencies downgraded Burkina Faso's outlook from stable to negative, warning of reduced foreign investment. Despite these challenges, the administration maintained its course. The Ministry of Finance announced a revised budget that prioritized agriculture, local manufacturing and energy independence projects, aiming to reduce reliance on foreign aid over the next 5 years. Officials projected that, if domestic refining and oil production reached planned capacity, Burkina Faso could replace more than half of its current foreign aid with internal revenues by the end of the decade. For Traoré, the message was clear. Economic independence would require short-term sacrifices, but the long-term gains could fundamentally reshape the nation's future. The regional response to President Ibrahim Traoré's defiance was immediate and strategically significant. Within days, Mali and Niger, both recent critics of Western influence, publicly endorsed Burkina Faso's stance. Joint communiques from Bamako and Niamey praised the rejection of exploitative resource agreements and hinted at coordinated economic policies in the future. Economic analysts in West Africa began speaking of a potential Sahel resource bloc, an informal alliance aimed at keeping the region's mineral wealth under local control. Together, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso produce more than 70% of the gold mined in the Sahel and hold untapped reserves of uranium and oil that are highly sought after by global powers. European capitals reacted cautiously. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron convened a closed-door meeting with energy and mining executives to assess the risk of losing key African supply lines. French companies currently hold stakes in at least 8 active mining projects in Burkina Faso, many of which could be subject to renegotiation or nationalization. International markets responded with unease. The price of gold rose by nearly 3% in the week following Traoré's announcement, driven by speculation that West African supply could face restrictions. Oil traders monitored developments closely, given the potential for the Sahel to become a more active player in regional energy markets. Diplomatically, Burkina Faso began looking eastward. Representatives from Turkey, Russia, and China expressed interest in new partnerships, offering technology transfers and infrastructure investments in exchange for access to future gold and oil production, but under terms that Traoré's government insists would preserve national ownership. For ordinary Burkinabe citizens, the shift carried both hope and risk. While nationalist sentiment surged, concerns about rising prices for imported goods also grew. The Ministry of Trade reported a 5% increase in the cost of essential commodities within the first month of France's aid suspension. Still, for many across the Sahel, the choice was clear. Short-term hardship was a price worth paying for a future where Africa's resources were no longer dictated by foreign capitals. In Washington, the rejection by President Ibrahim Traore was viewed as a direct challenge to long-standing U.S. influence in West Africa. Policy advisors at the State Department warned that if Burkina Faso's example spread, American access to strategic minerals could be at risk. Gold from the Sahel already accounts for an estimated 15% of global supply, and Burkina Faso alone exports more than $2 billion United States dollars worth annually. Former U.S. officials described the move as a dangerous precedent, arguing that it could embolden other African leaders to reject Western-backed agreements. Think tanks such as the Atlantic Council and the Center for Strategic and International Studies released reports urging the administration to contain the fallout through diplomatic pressure, targeted sanctions, and strengthen ties with other West African states willing to cooperate. Media coverage in the United States was divided. Conservative commentators accused Traoré of aligning with anti-Western blocs and jeopardizing economic stability in the region. Progressive voices countered that Burkina Faso's decision was an act of sovereignty, consistent with the principles of self-determination. At the United Nations, the U.S. delegation stopped short of direct condemnation but emphasized the importance of maintaining open markets and mutually beneficial resource partnerships. Behind the scenes, diplomatic cables leaked to international media indicated that Washington was exploring coordinated responses with European allies, particularly France. Meanwhile, analysts on Wall Street tracked market reactions. Gold prices climbed modestly, and shares of mining companies with West African operations saw declines of between 5 and 8%. Energy sector analysts speculated that if Burkina Faso pursued independent oil development, projected at 20,000 barrels per day, it could reshape regional fuel markets within a decade. For the U.S. foreign policy establishment, the episode underscored a growing reality. Africa's younger generation of leaders is less willing to accept the post-Cold War status quo. As one senior diplomat admitted anonymously, the old playbook is not working anymore. In Paris, the fallout from President Ibrahim Traoré's rejection of France's offer was immediate. French President Emmanuel Macron convened an emergency meeting with senior ministers and corporate leaders from the mining and energy sectors. France currently sources over 20% of its imported gold from West Africa, and losing access to Burkina Faso's reserves could disrupt a supply chain worth hundreds of millions of euros annually. Leaked reports from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs revealed discussions of punitive measures, including suspending development programs, restricting trade finance, and lobbying the European Union for coordinated sanctions. Macron himself, in a televised statement, called the rejection a regrettable setback for Franco-African cooperation, framing Traoré's stance as politically driven rather than economically rational. Other global players saw opportunity. Russia, already expanding its presence in Mali and the Central African Republic, signaled readiness to supply Burkina Faso with military training and infrastructure investment in exchange for mining partnerships. China, with its vast experience in resource development, proposed joint ventures that would guarantee Burkina Faso majority ownership while securing Beijing a steady supply of gold and oil. Turkey offered a package of technology transfers and infrastructure support for refining and energy projects. These overtures reflected a broader trend, a multipolar race for influence in Africa, where traditional Western dominance is increasingly contested. Media coverage across the continent, particularly through Africa News, portrayed Traoré's move as a historic stand and a decisive break from neo-colonial economics. Analysts interviewed on African television emphasized that this was not an isolated act, but part of a broader shift in regional politics. Across West Africa, citizens debated whether their own leaders should follow Burkina Faso's example, with polls in Mali and Niger showing majority support for reviewing existing foreign resource agreements. For the first time in decades, the strategic narrative in Africa was not being set exclusively in Washington, Paris, or London, but in capitals like Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. And that change, as many observers noted, could have consequences far beyond the gold and oil markets. Weeks after the dramatic rejections, fragments of the actual contract proposals began to surface, leaked through a combination of diplomatic insiders and investigative journalists. What they revealed explained why President Ibrahim Traoré had stood so firm, even under the weight of US and French pressure. According to these reports, the American-backed deal, valued at more than $3 billion United States dollars, included a provision granting foreign operators control over 60% of Burkina Faso's gold revenues for 25 years. Oil rights were also tied to the agreement, with production quotas favoring US-linked companies for the same period. The French proposal carried similar terms, but with an additional clause. Paris would retain exclusive refining rights for all gold extracted under French managed concessions, effectively forcing Burkina Faso to export raw materials to France for processing. This arrangement would have diverted an estimated 500 million euros annually from Burkina Faso's domestic economy. Both agreements contained penalty provisions that would have made early withdrawal financially crippling, locking the nation into dependency regardless of political changes. For Traoré, accepting either deal would have meant handing over the country's most valuable assets for an entire generation. These revelations transformed public perception. What some in the West had framed as a reckless gamble now appeared to be a calculated defense of national sovereignty. Across the Sahel, leaders and citizens alike began questioning how many other development partnerships carried similar hidden costs. In the weeks since that pivotal announcement, Burkina Faso has stood its ground. Aid has been cut, threats have been made, and the pressure from Washington and Paris remains relentless. Yet in Ouagadougou, life moves forward, markets still open at sunrise, children still walk to school, and the national flag still waves proudly above government buildings. Under President Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, the nation has begun charting its own economic course. Gold refineries are being planned, oil reserves are set for domestic management, and partnerships are being sought that preserve majority ownership for the people of Burkina Faso. The road will be difficult, but for the first time in decades it will be theirs to walk. As Traoré himself declared, "We did not ask permission to be free, we stood up and claimed it." If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to join the journey of an Africa that will no longer bow its head. God bless Africa. God bless the people of Burkina Faso.